4 dealerships, 4 identical verdicts, $24,000 to replace a transmission that, as it turned out, was never broken. Kathleen Barrow stood in the lot of the 4th dealership, holding the printout, when Ronald Voss smoothed his jacket, smiled the smile of a man who had already moved on, and said, "I can make the numbers work on a new one today." She looked at him for a long moment. "You haven't opened the hood." He kept smiling. "The diagnostics are very comprehend. You haven't opened the hood." The smile held 2 more seconds, then dissolved. She drove east, no destination, until the car decided for her. One hard shudder, then silence, coasting dead-end onto County Road, shouldered in front of a garage that looked like it had survived 3 recessions through pure stubbornness. A man in a work shirt came out. No clipboard, no scanner. He lifted the hood, placed both hands on the engine frame, and stood completely still for 15 seconds and looked at her. "Transmission's perfectly fine." She stared at him.
"That's not what the dealerships just told me."
He glanced back at the engine. "I know," and went back to work. The morning Kathleen Barrow walked into the 4th dealership, she already knew what they were going to say. She knew because the first 3 had used almost the exact same words. The same measured pause before delivering the verdict. The same slight tilt of the head, like they were breaking bad news to someone who wouldn't fully understand it. The same sentence, give or take a few $1,000s. Total loss on the transmission. You're better off in something new. She went anyway, because that was what Kathleen did. She gathered data. She cross-referenced. She didn't just pigeon when for could tell her the same thing with greater statistical confidence. Except this time the data was lying. She just didn't know it yet. The Porsche 911 sat in a parking spot at Arrow Freight Solutions every morning like punctuation. Silver, 2009. 67,000 miles on an engine that had never once been pushed past what it could handle. Her father Raymond had bought it the year he retired from 35 years of structural engineering. A man who calculated low door tolerances for bridges in 3 different states, and had never once bought himself anything that wasn't strictly necessary. The Porsche was the one exception, the single indulgence of a full life. He'd driven it the way he'd lived. "Such cars talk, Kate," he used to say, and she used to smile at that. The way you smile at something you try and charming without fully believing. You just have to slow down enough to hear them. Raymond Barrow died 16 months ago, Tuesday morning. He simply didn't wake up. No warning, no long illness. Just a Tuesday that turned into a Tuesday after it, quieter by one voice. Kathleen kept the car. She sold the house. She put the Seiko in her nightstand drawer. She drove the Porsche to work and to the grocery store, and sometimes on weekends down county roads with no particular destination. And she didn't fully understand why until the car started shuddering in 3rd gear and she'd realized she was furious. Not at the car, not really, but at the idea that one more thing her father had loved might be taken from her. So she started calling dealerships. Because data. Because process. Because that was how Kathleen Barrow handled things that hurt. The first dealership was Pelacovers on Meridian Avenue, 40 minutes from her office, with a service bay that smelled like money and a waiting room with espresso machines and magazines no one read. Marcus Webb handled her intake. 52 years old, thick forearms, the unhurried confidence of a man who had been right enough times to stop explaining himself. He plugged the OBD scanner in, waited for the codes, printed 7 pages of results. He slid the papers across the hotel, looking at first potential scene. It's the scene 4. Thought a cluster of transmission faults as a phosphor as it added up to one conclusion. Transmission's gone. Full replacement. 18 to 20, depending on parts. Kathleen looked at the papers, then at Marcus.
"Did you open the hood?"
He looked up then, just briefly. The look of a man recalculating who he was dealing with. "The scan gives us very clear diagnostic data, Ms. Barrow." She waited. He didn't answer the actual question. She picked up the papers and walked out into the morning air and sat at them for 6 minutes with the engine off. Then she drove to the second dealership because one data point was not a conclusion. Sterling Auto Group was different in atmosphere, identical in outcome. The service coordinator was a woman named Devin Cole. Mid-30s, newly certified, genuinely engaged in a way that Marcus hadn't been. She explained every fault code. She showed Kathleen where each one appeared in the diagnostic chain. She seemed, honestly, like she wanted to help. And she took $20,000 in for a full transmission replacement. That was the one that stung. Not because it was the highest number. The third dealership, Momentum Imports, would hit $23,000. But because Devon's sincerity made it feel like the truth. When someone who seems like they're trying to help you tells you the same thing as everyone else, the instinct is to stop arguing. Kathleen almost did. Almost. Amenacum, the kicker, came from a technician who paused mid-explanation to add, "Honest to see out this mileage, you might want to consider whether it's worth saving." He said it gently, helpfully even. 67,000 miles. Raymond had treated that engine like something precious. The technician said it like the car was already Emery. She sat in the parking lot of Momentum Imports for 10 minutes without starting the engine, which was longer than 6 minutes, which meant she was getting worse, not better,
at absorbing each successive verdict.
She drove to Vostov Automotive. Ron Vostov's build dealership on the north edge of the business district, in a building that was essentially an argument made of glass and imported stone. The showroom floor had track light down to every vehicle looked like it was mid-reveal. The service entrance had its own lounge. There were plants that someone was paid specifically to keep alive. Voss himself came out to meet her. That's the first unusual thing. Dealers sent service managers. Suddenly, which should have registered as courtesy but landed closer to choreography. He was 38, blondish hair swept back, a gray suit cut well enough that it communicated money without announcing it. The handshake was firm and direct. The eye contact lasted exactly long enough to convey confidence, then broke off clean, practiced service of a man who had learned to seem present while already thinking ahead. He looked at service history, nodded slowly, twice. The nod of a man reaching a conclusion he'd expected. Total loss on the transmission. One hand in his jacket pocket, already angled slightly toward the showroom, but body language doing the Z-sizzling before the mouth got there.
I've seen this on the 9-7
Generation. Once these codes come up together, it's not if, it's what when. Honestly, Miss Barrow, you'd be better off in something newer. We have a certified pre-owned 992 in the back. Same driving feel, better reliability. I can make the numbers work today.
Kathleen looked at him for a moment.
Not the showroom. Not the brochure was already reaching for it. Him. You haven't opened the hood. Not a question. Because she already knew. Voss smiled. The kind of smile that acknowledged the comment without engaging it. The diagnostics are very comprehensive. You haven't opened the hood. The smile held for 2 more seconds. Then it dissolved, not dramatically. Just the way a held expression dissolves when the person decides it's no longer useful. He said nothing. She picked up her bag and walked back to the Porsche and sat behind the wheel with both hands at 10-92 and felt a very specific kind of anger. Not hot, not loud, the kind that settles in the chest and presses outward at the ribs. 4 dealerships. 4 identical verdicts. Not a single one of them had opened the hood. She drove east because destination. The Porsche shuddered as a second gear, hesitated hard in third, and she's kept her speed low and her hands steady and tried to decide what came next. There were options. There were always options. Find a 5th dealership. Except one of Porsche estimates. Call Porsche Honest's club forum she booked 3 days ago and never gotten around to posting on. The car made its own decision at 3:14 in the afternoon on County Road 9. One hard shudder through what felt like the entire length of the vehicle. Then silence. The engine cut. The dashboard bloomed amber warning lights in a sequence that felt, even in the moment, slightly theatrical. The Porsche car started to button the gravel shoulder and stopped. Kathleen sat with her hands still on the wheel. The road ahead was empty. Trees on both sides, the kind of trees that exist in the in-between spaces of a mid-sized American city. Not quite rural or not quite suburban, just there. The light was going orange and long. The particular fall at a late afternoon in October, when everything casts a shadow twice its own length, and 30 meters ahead, on the right side of the road, half behind a row of overgrown hedges that had clearly been making territorial advances for several years. A low brick building with a corrugated metal roof. Paint on the brickwork faded but not gone. A sign above the door, hand-painted, black letters on white background, gone slightly yellow.
Out of repair. Since 1968.
Below it, smaller letters added by a different hand at some point in the last few decades, family-owned. The parking lot in front was cracked asphalt with grass finding its way through every seam. 2 older trucks sat on jack stands near the sidewall, hoods open, neither of them visibly tended.
A single folding aluminum chair occupied the concrete beside the front door with the particular permanence of furniture that has been in one spot long enough that no one remembers deciding to put it there.
Kathleen looked at this place for a moment, looked at her phone, opened the Roadside Assistance app, and started entering her location.
We got through the first 2 digits of the contact number. The door on the side of the building open.
Girl stepped out. 13, maybe 14. Taller than you'd expect for that age, still growing into it. Brown hair pulled back in a low ponytail. Gray t-shirt with a small bleach stain near the hem. Jeans with a dark smear along the left knee that was either motor oil or something adjacent to it. She was carrying a flat plastic tray full of socket heads, the kind organized by size. She walked to a pegboard mounted on the exterior wall and put it in place on one hook. The focus of someone who has done this particular task enough times that it no longer requires thought, only presence. She looked at the Porsche. She looked at Kathleen. Then she went back inside. Kathleen lowered the phone 50 seconds past us, maybe a minute. The door opened again. The man who came through it moved differently than anyone else she'd watched to her car all week. No clipboard, no tablet. No scanner case slung over one shoulder. He was in his mid-40s, lean in the way that comes from years of physical work rather than in anything deliberate. Wearing the dark blue work shirt with the name Smashed Stephen embroidered on the chest in white thread. Brown hair gone silver at the temples and beginning to silver at the crown. A face with the particular geography of someone who spent a lot of time squinting under fluorescent lights or into engine bays. A set to the jaw, lines at the corners of gray eyes. Not unhandsome, but not arranging itself for anyone's benefit. He walked to the Porsche without asking anything, without introducing himself, without the modified service
counterparts that every dealership or he had adopted in her presence was weak. That half-course 4 inches, that's someone managing a customer rather than looking at a car. He just looked at the car,
stood beside the hood for a moment with his hands loose at his sides, then put both hands on the front edge and lifted it. Not the scanner, not diagnostic tablet, not any of the equipment that 4 different certified facilities had reached for first. He placed the palms flat on the edge of the engine bay, the metal that framed the engine rather than the engine itself, and he was still, completely still. The kind of still that is an absence of movement. Presence at a different frequency. Kathleen counted quietly in her head, somewhere between 15 and 20 seconds. Then he straightened up. Looked at her with an expression that was done the diagnostic performed. Was simply certain, the way a statement is certain before it's made. Transmission's perfectly fine. 5 words. Exactly contrary to everything she'd heard in the past 8 days. She stared at him. That's not what 4 dealerships told me.
He glanced back at the engine. And looking at then this was the part she fully explained
Even to herself, standing on the shoulder of a county road with a dead car and a stranger who had just told her everything she'd been told was wrong. She believed him. Not because he'd given her a reason. Not because he'd produced a report or cited his credentials. But because he hadn't tried to convince her. Because conviction that doesn't need to perform itself looks different from conviction that does. She just didn't know yet what to do with that belief. His name was on his shirt. She'd already read it. She said it out loud anyway, not as a greeting, almost as a test. My car died on the road in front of your shop, I noticed. 4 solicitors told me some button was gone. You looked at it for 20 seconds and say they're all wrong. Pause. Defensive? Not impatient. Yes. Can you tell me why you're right and they're wrong? He looked at the engine again, then back at her. When do you have time? Which was not the answer she expected. She was expecting credentials, history, a technical explanation designed to establish authority. Instead, he was asking about her schedule, as though the explanation was forthcoming, but only when she was ready to receive it, not when it was convenient for him to deliver. The anger in her chest shifted slightly. Not gone, not replaced, just reconfigured. My car won't start, she said. I'm not going anywhere. Then come inside, he said, and turned and walked toward the garage door. The girl was in the doorway by the time Kathleen reached it. Arms crossed, weight on one hip, assessment in her eyes. The frank evaluation of a child who hasn't yet learned to pretend she isn't sizing people up. Dad doesn't like strangers in the work area when they haven't been invited, the girl said. Kathleen stopped. I'm the owner of the car he just opened without asking. He invites himself to cars. Cars don't get an opinion. A beat. People do. Another beat. Shorter. But you can stand in the doorway. You can see everything from there. She stepped aside. Not all the way, just enough. Kathleen stood in the doorway. Her name was Cora. She offered this without being asked, while transferring a second set of tools from a rolling cart to a wall-mounted cabinet, each socket to its labeled hook, each wrench to its marked slot, in the practice sequencing of a kid who'd grown up in this space rather than merely visiting it. The inside of Dre Auto Repair did not look the way the outside suggested it might. The floor was clean concrete, not pristine, but swept. Tools on the walls were organized by a logic that would have been invisible to most people but was legible once you looked. Not by size or type, but by frequency of use. The most reach for things at hand height, the more specialized items higher and lower. A parts drawer system ran the length of the east wall, each drawer labeled in small, precise handwriting. Adrian Culliffe was playing something, country old, the kind with actual fiddle, at volume barely audible under the ambient sounds of the garage itself. A single lamp on an arm over the main work bay threw good light without flooding. 2 hydraulic lifts, one in use where the truck Stevens was apparently mid-service on before the Porsche appeared. A small office in the back with a glass window and, visible through it, just caught with a blanket on it and a paper bag full beside it. Kathleen registered all of this in the time it took her to decide she was going to stay. She called her assistant from the doorway, rescheduled her 6 p.m. call, and texted her contact at the investor group that she'd follow up tomorrow. Then she put the phone in her pocket and watched Stephen Dre work. He had moved to the Porsche without fanfare, brought it into the second bay while she'd been on the phone. Now he was underneath it, lying on a creeper, running an inspection lead along what she's assumed was the undercarriage. Though from her own focus she could only see his lower legs and came brushing from him toward the rear of the vehicle. He stopped twice. The second stop lasted nearly 2 minutes. Cora bit her elbow with a Coke.
Not a question yet, and extended and confirmed on the outside,
Because it had come a mini fridge that was older than Kathleen's lifetime. He works to bed when it's quiet, Chad. Informational, not critical. Does he always have company while he works? Cora considered this with the gravity of someone taking the question seriously. Not usually, but he also doesn't usually find fresh dust in front of the driveway. Kathleen opened the Coke. Does that happen often? Cars dying in front? No, a small pause. But when it does, he always looks at them. She drank and watched and didn't ask the next obvious question. But because Cora had always closed the subject by picking up a torque wrench and beginning to clean it with a rag, with the focused efficiency of someone whose hands needed to be doing something while her mind worked on other things, which was, Kathleen thought, a habit that did not look like it had been recently acquired. Stephen was from under the car after another 10 minutes. Stood, stretched his neck slightly to the left. One of those small self-maintenance movements that people do without noticing. Moved to the engine bay, placed one hand flat against the transmission housing, held it there. Kathleen waited for him to explain why he didn't. He was listening, not to sound exactly, though there was some faint ticking from the cooling metal more. There was just receiving information through a different channel than any of the diagnostic systems she'd watched all week. 45 seconds, maybe. Then he straightened up. You said 4 dealerships. Which 4? She listed them.
Sterling, Momentum, Voss.
He was quiet for a moment.
Did any of them pull the sensor harness? None of them that I saw. They all ran scanners.
They ran scanners, he repeated, not as an echo, but as a confirmation of something he already suspected. And the scanner told them where the system recorded the fault. So they looked there. His hands were on the edge of the engine bay. Fault code points at the transmission. That's where they looked. That's what their training tells them to do, and their software for reliability protocols. Replace the source of the fault codes. Clear the codes. Move on. A pause. Then, except codes are downstream of the actual problem. She straightened up from where she'd been leaning against the doorframe. Moved closer. Meaning, he looked at her directly the first time in a while. And there was something in the way he did it that was different from the diagnostic assessments the 4 dealership technicians had given her, which had all been versions of reading a person to determine how much they could absorb. This was just looking at her. Shift sensor module. Secondary feedback unit. It's sending the wrong load signal to the transmission control unit. The TCU thinks the transmission is under stress it isn't actually experiencing. So the transmission does what it was supposed to do. It defends itself, refuses to engage. He held his fingers 5 centimeters apart. The part that's actually wrong is about this big. Kathleen looked at the space between his fingers.
Looked at the transmission housing. Sorts of diagnostic reports into the 3 separate estimates between $18,000 to $23,000. So why didn't any of them find it?
Because nobody pulled the harness, he said.
No, but nobody's traced the signal back to its source.
The software told them the problem was in the transmission. The problem was in the transmission. Just not the way they thought. Every fault code was real. Every code generated by a transmission protecting itself from a signal that doesn't reflect reality. The software wasn't wrong. It just answered a different question than the one that mattered. The sentence landed in a way she didn't fully expect. She pulled out her phone and wrote it in her notes without planning to, then felt briefly self-conscious about it. That didn't. Can you fix it? The look he gave her wasn't impatient or cautious. It was the look of someone thinking genuinely, which is a different expression than the look of someone deciding what to say. Modules discontinued. Manufacturer stopped production in 2016. He glanced toward the back of the shop, the storage room behind the office. But I might have something compatible in the box inventory. Different application, but the feedback architecture is close. If I can predict these signal parameters and adapt the housing, it'll work.
Might.
Will, he said. The correction was simple, not boastful. I need tonight. The country station on the radio had shifted to something slower, instrumental, fiddle and steel guitar in a minor key. The light in the garage was going warmer as the afternoon died outside. Cora had disappeared into the back room at some point and come back with a paperback and seated herself on the cot-verve of the office window, legs crossed, reading with a book light clipped to the page. Kathleen looked at all of this, looked at the Porsche in the second bay, looked at the man standing at the edge of the engine with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and grace on both forearms in the particular way it accumulates over years rather than hours. Thought about her father also sitting in this exact car on Sunday afternoons and going nowhere fast, with the radio on and both hands at ease on the wheel. Cars talk, Kate. She had always thought he was being sentimental. People sometimes romanticize the things they love. She was starting to think of inventing I'll stay, Stephen looked at her. There's a motel on 9 about 3 miles east. I know. I'll stay here. He held her gaze for a second, not to convince her otherwise. He didn't seem particularly invested in the outcome.
More like he was logging information and smashing and listing accordingly.
Cora, he called toward the back room, not loud. The word carried exactly as far as it needed to.
Girl, appeared in some first doorway, book still open, no finishing finger marking the place.
Coffee, and if we have it, that other chair. Cora looked at Kathleen, then at her father, then at the book. We have it, she said, and went to find it. The chair turned out to be a wooden stool with a crumb left that's been repaired with electrical tape in 2 places, which was in some way more comfortable than anything in the Pinnacle Porsche waiting room had been. Kathleen set it near the second bay entrance, close enough to see, far enough not to be underfoot, and she sat down and watched Stephen Dre begin to take her father's car apart one careful layer at a time. He didn't talk unnecessarily. He moved through the Porsche in a systematic way that had its own internal logic. Not left to right or top to bottom, but in the order that the investigation required, each action informing the next. He wasn't performing expertise. He was just using it, which is what expertise looks like when it doesn't need an audience. Cora brought coffee at some point. A mug that sat in Centrifuge Immunity Fusionity 19 on the side, hot black, no ceremony. Set it on the edge of the parts cabinet near Kathleen without interrupting anything. Then went back to her book. Kathleen held the mug and watched and tried to locate the source of what she was feeling, which was complicated in a way she didn't have an immediate framework for. Relief wasn't quite right. She hadn't been given certainty yet, only direction. Trust was closer, but trust in what? A man she'd met 40 minutes ago. A garage that had existed since 1968, through whatever combination of stubbornness and local need had kept it alive. A read of a car that had taken 20 seconds in 2 hands and no technology to deliver. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it without taking it out of her pocket. Ronald Voss. Then 30 seconds later, Voss again. She left both calls to voicemail. Cora appeared in the office doorway without a book this time, just standing watching her father work, with an expression that was quieter than the one she'd worn with Kathleen, less evaluative, more simply attentive. He used to look on race cars, Cora said. Not to Kathleen specifically, more to the air between them. What endurance racing seems for a long time. She paused before. Kathleen didn't ask what before meant. She'd heard enough to know the shape of a sentence that trails off like that, the weight it carries in the space after the last word.
3 years.
When Mom got sick,
Again, no particular inflection. Not flat.
that would have been its own kind of performance. Just stated the way you state things you finished grieving the announcement of, even if the grief itself is still ongoing. He came home, opened the garage back up. That was it.
Was it?
4 words that contained an entire architecture of decision. Kathleen looked at the man bent over her father's engine in a garage that had been his grandfather's before it was his. Father's before. Briefly, unexpectedly. About the morning 16 months ago, where for the morning stood in her father's kitchen trying to understand how a man who'd been alive the day before was simply not there anymore. About how the first thing she'd done that same day was open her laptop and start a spreadsheet. Funeral logistics, estate tasks, a column for calls to make. Not because she was cold, because she was afraid of the moment when there was nothing left to organize. Maybe that was what a grudge looked like if you were a different kind of person. Something that needed doing. Something you could put your hands on. Outside, the county road was completely dark. The amber overhead lights in the garage turned everything slightly golden, and the radio played on at its barely audible register, and Cora the Vessi was asleep on the cot with the light was still clipped to her book. And Stephen Drathi worked through it, all with the unhurried focus of someone who had already decided to crap and was simply doing it. Around 11, he looked up from the undercarriage and said, "It's the module." Secondary feedback unit. Hairline fracture in one of the internal conductor pathways. He said it quietly, as not to wake Cora. Not enough to cause complete failure. Enough to generate a continuously escalating false signal. Kathleen set down her second mug of coffee. Every dealership did exactly what their train told them to do, she said, and heard that she was repeating him back to himself from earlier in the evening. Yes, and you did something their training didn't cover. He thought about that for a moment. I kept listening past the machine stopped talking. She wrote that down too. By 2 a.m., she was running on the particular wakefulness that replaces exhaustion after a certain point. The kind where the body has given up trying to sleep and settled into a different gear. Stephen had gone into the back storage room 40 minutes earlier and come back with a cardboard box and a sketch on a notepad. A diagram he'd drawn from memory, reference points for the recalibration he was going to need to perform. Steve did it for a few minutes. He made 2 corrections with the same pencil and set it beside the workbench. He'd woken Cora once, briefly. 2 sentences, voice low. She did back storage grind as a running for sudden question and returned in 6 minutes with a small bin of connectors sorted by gauge. Set on the bench, gone back to the cot. Asleep again in under 90 seconds. The efficiency of that exchange, wordless, precise, completely unsentimental, was one of the things Kathleen would remember afterward. Not the drama of discovery or the technical precision of the fix itself, that. The way 2 people who have built a life alongside each other develop up a language that runs underneath speech. At 4:17 in the morning, with the radio still going on its shelf, and Cora breathing slowly on the cot through the glass office window, Stephen Stray closed the hood of the Porsche, wiped his hands, set the cloth on the bench, leaned back slightly against the front fender, turned and held out the keys. Kathleen looked at him. "You said you figured it out in the first 45 minutes. Knew what it was in about 45 minutes, he said. Took the rest of the night to do it correctly. She got into the car, turned the key. The end came alive the way she hadn't heard it in weeks, immediate even, but without hesitation that had been building so gradually she'd almost stopped noticing it. She moved through the keys. First, second, fourth, each one smooth, each one without protest. The transmission doing exactly what it was designed to do, because it was now averaging inaccurate information for the first time in however long the sensor had been failing. She sat in the running car in the middle of the night garage and felt something that didn't have a clean name. Not just relief, not just vindication. Something that sat lower in the chest. The car had been capable of this the whole time. It had been failed. repeatedly, expensively, by people who felt trusted their instruments more than the evidence immediately in front of them. She thought of her father, steady. Control also listen for something was wrong before it became a real problem. She thought she understood now what he'd been saying all those sunny afternoons. It wasn't sentiment, it wasn't metaphor, it was method. She wrote the check with the heater running and the dashboard lights warm and her hand steadier than she expected. $340. She handed it to Stephen through the car window. He looked at the amount, folded it once, tucked it into his shirt pocket. Doesn't seem like the right number, she said. It's the right number. She looked at the Porsche's dash for a moment, at her father's handwriting, still faintly visible on a piece of tape on the glove compartment latch where he'd written the service interval date years ago and never replaced the tape. He always said cars talk, she said. My father? He used to say you just had to slow down enough to hear them. Stephen said for a beat. He was right. She nodded once, put the car in gear, rolled toward the open bay door and the dark county road beyond it, and the first pale suggestion of dawn beginning somewhere behind the trees to the east. Behind her, the radio played on. Chorus slapped.
The ember light held the garage in its warmth of slide open register. Stephen stood with his hands at yes as if a thumb forged the Porsche,
The way you watch something leave when you already will come back. Word count.
both once then 12 cups off bars off Tompio
106 to 100 words not met. Continuing to reach target. She didn't call Sharon Greer until she was back in her own apartment. Showered, changed, third coffee on the counter. The message she sent at 1:47 a.m. from the garage hadn't been planned. She'd been sitting on the stool with the electrical tape repair and her second mug of the community fair coffee, watching Stephen work. And she'd felt for the first time all week that something worth documenting was happening, something that would be invisible if no one looked. Sharon Greer covered the luxury auto market for the Tribune's weekend section and had been writing critically about dealership servants' practices since before Kathleen had any personal reason to care. They'd met 18 months ago at a regional business conference.
The kind of conference where you meet 50 people and actually remember too. Sharon was one of them, because she spent 20 minutes at a dinner explaining how the diagnostic software used by major dealerships had been designed in some scientific throughput, not optimized accuracy, and had made it funny somehow.
Funny and infuriating simultaneously, which was a difficult combination. Kathleen had texted her, I'm in a garage outside the city. Something's happening here you'd want to know about. Then gone back to watching the work. By the time Kathleen was home and showered and standing at her kitchen counter with coffee number 3, Sharon had already texted back twice, then called once, then sent a follow-up text that read, on my way. Sharon Greer arrived at Dre Auto Repair at 6:15 a.m. She was 39, with hair that was naturally sort between auburn and red depending on the light, cut short in a way that was as easy to maintain because Sharon Greer was not interested in maintenance that didn't produce results. She carried a mirrorless camera the way some people carry a phone, as an extension of the hand, already up and framing before a room had fully registered. She wore canvas sneakers and a jacket, with a broken zipper she'd been meaning to fix for 4 months. And she had the particular quality of someone who had conducted enough interviews in enough uncomfortable situations that comfort was no longer a variable she considered. She talked to Stephen for 12 minutes. He answered her questions in the same register he'd used all night. Not abbreviated, not performed, just accurate. She photographed the garage, the Porsche, the discontinued sensor module sitting on the workbench under the good light. She photographed the notepad with his hands drawn a calibration diagram, still lying open from the night before. She posted the piece at 7:12 a.m. The headline was not complicated. Quoted $24,000. A family garage fixed it overnight for $340. Kathleen read it at her kitchen's table, phone propped against her coffee mug, and thought, that's exactly what happened. Which sounds obvious, but accurate journalism often lands that way. Not revelatory in just the recognition that someone has described a true thing clearly. She was on her third read of the piece when her phone buzzed with a name she recognized, Ronald Voss. Calling, not texting, which told her something about his current state. She let it go to voicemail. He called again 2 minutes later. She had another coffee instead. The voicemail, when she listened to it 20 minutes later, was smooth. Mold. The voice of a man who had experienced delivering messages that didn't reveal what he was actually communicating. He said he'd seen the article and wanted to follow up on their conversation from the other day. He said he hoped she found a resolution that worked for her. He said the offer on the 9/9/92 was still available unless her circumstances changed. He didn't say anything about being wrong. He didn't need to. She'd already started drafting the reply she was going to send, and stopped because this was not a matter that email would resolve, and she was tired from no slow to say it again where she knew she'd be comfortable with later. She put the phone face down on the counter and looked out the window at a parking spot where the Porsche sat in the morning light doing nothing at all except existing, which it had apparently been capable of all along. She was due in the office at 9. The quarter was bad and the investors were watching, and she had a team that needed leadership more than she needed to keep standing in her kitchen and thinking about a man in a county road garage who had listened to a car that 4 other people had failed to hear. She picked up the phone, called her assistant, said she'd be in at 10.
She sat up back down at the table, with the golf and Jenny Sherman's article of almost on slowly, and did arithmetic on what the week had cost her. Not in money.
The 4 diagnostic fees she'd paid were not nothing, but in something harder to quantify. The erosion of confidence in process. The specific fatigue of being told the same wrong thing by people who had every credential for being right. She hadn't felt it while it was happening. She'd been too focused on solving the problem. But sitting here now, at 7:45 in the morning with the city waking up outside her window and the Porsche in the lot, some $340 worth of corrected diagnosis between her and a $24,000 mistake she'd almost made, she felt it. And underneath it, something else. Quitter, less clean. Oscar Torres is to Torres, as a matter of fact, from bad lift him. Home the crash, back up. That is it. She thought about the card in the back office, the paper up on the floor. The way Cora had woken at 2 in the morning and retrieved exactly what was needed and gone back to sleep in under 90 seconds, because that was just what the night required. She thought about what that kind of life costs and what it gives back. She was still thinking about it when her phone buzzed again. Not Voss this time. Systems moving. Articles moving. Kathleen looked at the notification count under the Tribune link Sharon had sent earlier. It had been 4,000 readers when she first checked. It was now 11,000 and climbing. She put the phone in her jacket pocket and picked up her keys. Voss Porsche started on the first turn, smooth, even, ready. She pulled out of the lot and onto the street and merged into the morning traffic headed toward the city. And the Anachen underneath her did exactly what it always been capable of doing. And she drove the way her father used to drive. Both hands oil not quite steady, listening. By 11 that morning, Sharon's article had 40,000 readers. By 2 in the afternoon, it had 112,000. By the time Kathleen got out of her last meeting and checked her phone in the elevator, the number had stopped being a number she could process emotionally and become simply a fact about the internet, and how it moves when something has a nerve that a lot of people have been waiting to see touched. The comments were the telling part. Not the shares, not the reactions. The comments. Because comments are where people stop performing and start confessing. What people were confessing in thread after thread under Sharon's piece was that this had happened to them. Different cars, different cities, different dollar amounts, same architecture, an authoritative voice, a scanner, a printout. A verdict delivered with the confidence of someone who had never hesitated being wrong. Thousands of people, it turned out, had been to some other version of the story, and had never right connected in it once it in. Sharon had given them the container. Kathleen read through the comments for 12 minutes in her office with the door closed, and then put her phone in her desk drawer and tried to work. The quarterly numbers needed attention. Her logistics director had questions about the Cincinnati routing contracts. The board wanted a preliminary read on Q4 projections before the phone was out. She answered 3 emails, then opened the desk drawer, then closed it, then opened it again. Not because she was checking the article, because Ronald Voss had texted since she'd last looked. And the text was not a voicemail this time. It was 3 sentences, and they were calibrated in a way that made the hair on her arms go slightly wrong. He hoped the situation had been resolved to her satisfaction. He noted that some of the claims in the article were characterizations rather than facts. He said he was so sure she understood the importance of accuracy in professional contexts. She read it twice, then set the phone back in the drawer and walked to her window and looked at the city for a moment. He wasn't threatening her. She knew that. He was doing something more targeted. He was reminding her that she was a CEO, that her name was attached to things, that accuracy was a two-way street she'd want to be careful on. He was suggesting, without saying it, that standing behind Sharon's article publicly might create frictions and she didn't need, which was true. The frictions were real. The quarter was bad. Her investors liked stability and disliked noise and had a tendency to conflate the two regardless of their actual relationship to each other. She stood at the window for a while longer, then went back to her desk and opened her laptop and read the Cincinnati contract instead. She was not done with this. She was just deciding when. The first car arrived at Dre Auto at 12:40 p.m. that same day. Not a car that had broken down on County Road 9. Not a car from the immediate area. A man in a Jaguar F-Type had driven 41 minutes from the west side of the city after reading Sharon's article at his desk and making a decision faster than most people make decisions about lunch. The symptom he described, a rhythmic knock that appeared above 3,500 RPM and vanished below it, had been attributed by two previous shop starts to a failing engine mount. The combined estimate for that repair across both shops was $4,400, with a range extending to $6,200 if additional components had deteriorated. Stephen listened to the symptom description, drove the car to the end of the driveway and back slowly, windows down. Spent 14 minutes underneath it with an inspection light. The heat shield on the exhaust had worked loose at one mounting point. A single bolt that had vibrated free over time, leaving a half-inch of play that produced a metallic contact sound at specific resonant frequencies. The shield was otherwise intact. The mount was fine. The engine was fine. He tightened the bolt. $1 for the labor. The bolt itself he pulled from the hardware drawer because it's a standard metric fastener, and he had 40 of them in a label bin. The man in the Jaguar stood in the cracked asphalt lot and looked at the bill for a while. Not in disbelief, more in the specific sense as someone recalibrating something. He said, "I took that car to 2 shops. They both ran full diagnostics."
Stephen wiped his hands. And they missed a loose fault. The diagnostics were flagged for that as a vibration anomaly in the powertrain system. Which it is. They would have looked at the mounts because that's what generates that code. And the mounts looked fine.
A pause. So they went to the next most likely cause. And then you came here. The man looked at Shikasa. Stephen. Stephen considered this with the unhurriedness of someone who's never had the internet to make an answer sounds more impressive than it is.
Also because the knock had a specific rhythm.
Engine mounts fail in a way that's responsive to load. This was responsive to frequency. Different problem. The man nodded slowly, paid, shook Stephen's hand with more firmness than the transaction required, and drove away in a car that no longer knocked, leaving Cora standing in the garage doorway updating a handwritten log she'd started on her own initiative, in a small spiral notebook with a green cover, listing each vehicle's complaint, the previous diagnosis, and what Stephen had actually found. She hadn't been asked to make this log. She'd looked at the situation, decided records were going to matter, and started making them. That was the first car. The second came an hour and 40 minutes later. A Maserati Ghibli, silver, with a persistent electrical fault that the owner's dealership had quoted $8,000 just to diagnose, with repair costs to be determined after assessment. The fault manifested as a random loss of power to the climate and infotainment systems. The drivetrain, not the safety systems, just of comfort trucks going dark for 3 to 8 seconds at unpredictable intervals. Stephen found an oxidized relay in the junction box behind the driver's kick panel. Oxidation from a slow seam to windshield seal, which had been allowing humidity to accumulate in the lower dash for somewhere between 1 and 2 years. He cleaned the relay contacts, reseated the relay, traced the seam, and sealed it with body cloth from the cabinet. Parts cost $11. Lane total bill $120. The Maserati owner, a woman in her early 60s named Sandra, who drove her classes on a chain around her neck and had brought a hardcover book to read during the wait, looked up when Stephen came out to tell her. She marked her page with extreme deliberateness, closed the book, looked at him. $8,000 to diagnose, she said. They'd have found it eventually. Can charge $1,000 to find a dirty relay. Stephen didn't agree or defend. He just handed her the bill and explained what he'd done. She read it twice, then looked at Cora, who was standing near the pegboard with her notebook, adding Sandra's car to the log. "How old are you?"
Sandra asked Cora. "Are you going to be a mechanic?" Cora considered this with the seriousness the question deserved. "I'm going to be something that requires knowing how things actually work. I haven't decided which one yet." Sandra looked at her for a moment, then at Stephen.
Then she paid and tipped, which wasn't something customers usually did at a garage, but she did it anyway in cash, leaving 2.20s on the counter and walking out without making a thing of it. So, this word started circling in the automotive forums by late afternoon. Sharon's article was getting picked up by secondary outlets, a regional car enthusiast site, then a general interest aggregator, then a consumer advocacy newsletter with 60,000 subscribers. And with each pickup came the same pattern. The story. People telling their own version. People tagging others and asking if this was the same thing that had happened to them, which it usually was. By 4 o'clock, Cora's green notebook had 7 entries. By 5-6, it had 11.
Stefan was stopping, except for the 20-minute. Cora made him stop.
Producing a sandwich from somewhere in the back room with the matter-of-fact authority of someone who understood that forgetting to eat was not discipline. It was just forgetting. He ate it standing at the workbench,
Looking at next car, which was a 2019 BMW M4, whose owner, a man named Douglas, with a watch that cost more than the diagnostic system as Kathleen had collected all week, had driven an hour from the suburbs south of reading 3 different comment threads pointing to Dre Auto as a place where someone would actually look at the car instead of at a screen.
Douglas had been told by 2 separate facilities that his car's intermittent hard downshift was on a mechatronic unit issue, a repair that for an M4 with DSG ran between $14,000 and $18,000. Stephen asked him to describe the shift behavior in detail, not the codes the shops had pulled, the behavior, what it felt like when it happened, under what conditions. Douglas, who had not been asked this question by either previous shop, talked for 4 minutes. Stephen listened without writing anything to Nathan. Then he drove the car, twice around the lot, which was not long enough to fully evaluate a high-performance drivetrain, but long enough to confirm something. He came back and went straight to the fluid service panel and checked the transmission fluid. Not the level, the quality, which required a small amount on a white cloth, and looking at it under the shop light. The fluid was degraded beyond its service specifications by a margin that suggested it had been sitting in the system for somewhere between 45 hours and 60 miles, and set on events of thousands mile interval manufacturer specified. It had the consistency and color of something that had been working too hard for too long. The mechatronic unit was trying to operate in hydraulic conditions it hadn't been designed for and was falling. And every computer in the car was reading instrumental as internal component failure, because that was the logical inference from the symptom, given that no one had thought to check the most basic maintenance variable first. Fluid change, $140 in parts. 2 hours of labor. Stephen changed it, drove the car again. The shift was immediate, completely unremarkable. The way good engineering behaves when it's been given what it needs. Douglas stood in the lot and said nothing for a while. He had the expression of a man doing arithmetic that kept coming out to the same number, which was the distance between $14,000 and $140. What that gap meant about the past 4 months he'd spent trying to resolve this. He asked, why did nobody just check the fluid? Stephen had heard this question 6 times in the past 6 hours. His answers were the same each time. Not a script, just the truth. Because the symptom profile looked like mechatronic failure, and when a scanner points at mechatronic failure, that's where attention goes. The fluid check is a maintenance item. It doesn't show up in a diagnostic fault code. It doesn't show up if someone thinks to look. Douglas nodded, paid, left a card, the kind of card that had a title under the name and no additional explanation she needed. He told Stephen if they call if he needs anything. Said it like he meant it. Stephen put the card in his shirt pocket next to the assistant Cora had made for the shop on the home printer 3 weeks ago, which he had declared necessary over his specific objection, and which had already been handed out 11 times. The green notebook had 14 entries by the time Cora went to bed at 9:30, which was later than usual, and which she negotiated by pointing out correctly that it was a Friday. She left the notebook on the workbench where Stephen would see it. He didn't look at it until almost midnight. When he did, he stood there for a moment reading through her entries, the dates, vehicles, the previous diagnosis, the actual findings, the cost delta between what people had been quoted and what they'd paid. Her handwriting was small and consistent, the kind of handwriting that comes from someone who takes notes seriously. He closed the notebook, set it back exactly where she'd left it, and went back to work.
Gary Lennon arrived 30 days after Sharon's article. He arrived designated in a truck pulling at a trailer, which contained a Porsche GT3 RS in the kind of condition that indicated its owner understood that condition was not an accident.
The truck itself was a plain F250, well-maintained but not polished, which was the particular about Dan before he said them himself. He was 61. The silver hair worn short. A face that had spent up this one's sun and wind and was doing so honestly, with the creases to show for it. He carried himself with the stillness of someone who had been in rooms where the pressure was high often enough that he'd stopped performing calm and simply arrived at it. He'd heard Stephen's name from two people before arriving here. The first was a former sin racing who used the phrase,
Someone the industry let go of without understanding what it had lost,
which was the kind of description that didn't circulate widely,
because the industry generally didn't like to admit what it let go of.
The second was Jeffrey Crane, the collector who'd come in with the Porsche Cayman 4 days earlier, whose drivetrain actuator issue had been resolved in 90 minutes for $160. Jeffrey had said simply, "He'll hear it," which was enough for Lennon. He stood beside the GT3 RS while the trailer operator unhooked it and watched Stephen with assessing patience of someone who wasn't in a hurry to reach a conclusion. Stephen looked at the car, then at Lennon, then went to open the hood. The symptom Lennon described was a throttle response inconsistency at high RPM. Above 6,000, the engine occasionally hesitated before pulling cleanly through the rev range. Not dramatic, not something that would affect ordinary driving. But a G3 RS is not driven ordinarily, and in the context of a circuit or a canyon road where the rev range is the whole point. A hesitation of sub 6,000 was a thing you noticed. 2 manufacturer-authorized facilities had quoted throttle body assembly replacement, $22,000. Stephen drove the car. Not around the lot. Lennon, without being asked, had said to take it on Route 9 heading east where there was a straight stretch without cross-traffic. So Stephen did that, window down, reaching the RPM range where the issue appeared, and he listened. Not to the throttle saw and spun, or not only to that, to everything underneath it. When he came back, he went directly to the secondary intake system and pulled the resonance.
The throttle position sensors.
The primary one was reading clean. But the secondary sensor, the confirmation sensor that cross-checks the primary reading during high-load events, had a calibration drift of about 4%. Not enough to trigger a fault code. Enough to create a disagreement between the two sensors at the exact RPM range where the car was demanding maximum accuracy from the fueling system. The ECU, receiving conflicting instructions, was hesitating, protecting the engine, doing exactly what that was designed to do in the event of sensor disagreement, which was slow down and wait. To calibrate the secondary sensor, 45 minutes, $95. Lennon heard this explanation with his arms crossed and his eyes on the engine and the expression of someone who already understood the technical detail, but was listening for something underneath it. When Stephen finished, Lennon was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm going to tell you something. See what you do with it." Stephen waited. Ellison told him about a race at Daytona 8 years ago, an endurance event, 24 hours. The kind of race where engineers track every system in real time and make calls that can win or cost a team everything. A transmission on the lead car had been showing fault patterns across 3 telemetry systems, all of them pointing toward catastrophic failure some final hours. The team's analysis was unanimous. Pull the car, switch to the back, preserve the points position. The only engineer who disagreed was a 36-year-old transmission specialist who had asked for 5 minutes with the team principal before the call was made, who had said, in the direct and unperformative way that had apparently been his only available register, "The transmission isn't failing. The sensor cascade is generating false data. If you pull the car based on this readout, you're pulling a problem that doesn't exist." The team had listened, The car had run. The transmission had been fine for the remaining 9 hours. The car had finished second overall, which in that particular year, against that particular field, was kind of result that teams built the following season around. The engineer had not been publicly credited, because from the outside nothing had happened. A crisis that had been anticipated simply hadn't materialized, which looked from the outside like good fortune or good engineering in general. The specific intervention, the specific disagreement, the specific voices that had said, listen to the car, not the data, none of that had made it into the post-race coverage. They called you the listener, Lennon said, in the team, unofficially. Just what the word was. Stephen was L's workbench. He had his back to Lennon, returning a tool to its hook. He was still for a moment. Then, work was the same whether anyone knew. Lennon's exceptional shift is not dramatically, just at a degree. The look of someone who's heard that kind of answer before and knows what it costs to mean it. You don't have to be modest about it. Not modest. Stephen turned, just accurate. Cora was in the office doorway. She had a way of appearing in that doorway without announcing herself. It just wasn't eavesdropping, exactly. It was more that genre in a space where conversations about her father's past occasionally surfaced, and she'd learned to be present for them without making herself the subject of attention. She looked at the floor, then at Lennon, then at her father. The look on her face was the specific expression of a 13-year-old who's heard her parents say something true about themselves and doesn't know what with the fact that she finds it painful. Stephen looked at her, not for long, just long enough to register. He said, I stopped because the job that mattered most was here. Cora didn't look up again, but she also didn't leave. Len sat down in the aluminum folding chair, which had somehow migrated over the course of the past several days and become a permanent fixture near the parts cabinet. He had brought coffee from the place on Route 9. He drank it. Stephen went back to work on a separate vehicle that had arrived that afternoon, an Aston Martin DB11 with an electrical fault that 2 certified technicians had failed to trace, which was occupying the second bay. The conversation between Lennon and Cora that developed in the following 20 minutes was not loud and was not managed by anyone. Lennon asked her about school. Not performatively, actually asked, waited for the answer, followed up on the specific things she said. Cora answered in the way of what is answered as adults who asked questions without already having decided what they thought about her. With something close to full honesty. She told him she was doing well in school, but found most of it underutilizing. She told him she kept the repair log not because her father had asked, but because it seemed like the kind of thing that would matter later. She told him her mother had been a civil engineer who specialized in structural load analysis. She had died 3 years ago of ALS, and that the thing she missed most about was not something she could ascribe properties except had to be with particular quality of attention. The way her mother could be in a room without performing the fact of being in it. Lennon listened to all of this. Then your dad has that quality too. It's Cora considered this for a beat. I know it's why off the green. For green book. For in N23 entries. The Aston Martin had a grounding issue in the body control module that had been misread by its dealership as a BCM software fault. A misdiagnosis that would have resulted in a module replacement at $6,800. Stephen found the actual grounding fault by tracing the harness manually, which was not a procedure that appeared on any standard diagnostic checklist, because the checklist assumed the grounding network was intact. Cost, $180 and 3 hours. The owner, a man who introduced himself only as Philip, and had the bearing of someone who had been wealthy long enough to have stopped thinking about it. How do you know where to look when the system doesn't tell you? And Stephen said the thing that Kathleen would later describe at the automotive showcase as the line that reordered how she thought about expertise. The system tells you what it measured. Can't tell you what was measuring. Lennon wrote that down, on his phone, in a way that suggested he wasn't going to forget it, but wanted to make sure. The story in the trade publication ran on a Tuesday morning, 10 days after Sharon's original article. Kathleen found out from Sharon, who texted her at 7:50 a.m. with a link and a 3-word message. Read this immediately. The piece was in a regional automotive compliance journal. Kind of publication that existed in a specific professional space between the literature jobs and regulatory reporting. read by people who dealt in licensing and liability. The author was listed as a staff correspondent, but the sourcing was anonymous throughout, which meant someone had made calls and had the calls returned, which in turn meant someone had decided that an appropriate response was preferable to no response.
Tom, draw auto repairs and all sources of office through unauthorized supply channels.
The word unauthorized appeared 3 times. The word unlicensed appeared twice. Nothing was stated directly. Everything was implied with the position of someone who understood exactly how much distance they needed to maintain to avoid a defamation problem while still making the point they wanted to make. Client Kathleen read it sitting in her car in the parking garage at her office building. The engine was running. She hadn't meant to sit there. She'd planned to be just straight up. But she read the piece and then she just sat. Here was the thing about implication. It didn't need to be true, effective. It needed only to be plausible enough that people who were already uncertain paused before committing. And the automotive forums, which had been enthusiastically directing people to Dre Auto for the past 10 days, already splintering. Some threads questioning whether a garage with unconventional sourcing should be crusted with high-value vehicles, which was a question generated entirely by an article that hadn't actually provided any evidence of unconventional sourcing, but had arranged words in a sequence that made the question feel reasonable. She knew where this had come from. Not because she had documentation or a paper trail. Because she understood how people when they feel those things being threatened.
She went upstairs to her offices and closed the doors and sat behind her desk and looked at her phone.
It made herself think about it clearly, which was the only way she knew how to think about things that mattered. The risks of saying something publicly were concrete. The company was going through a difficult water. Her investors tracked her public behavior the way they tracked earnings projections, with an eye toward what it might mean for stability. She had a board meeting in 3 weeks. She had a financing renewal conversation in 6. The risks of seeing nothing were less concrete but not smaller. She opened her laptop, closed it, opened it again, looked at the note on her phone, the one she'd been adding to since the night in the garage. The system tells her what it measured. Can't tell her what it missed measuring. Cars talk. You just have to slow down enough to hear them. Work was the same whether anyone knew. The compliance office called Dre Auto on a Wednesday morning to schedule the inspection, which came on Thursday. 2 officials at clipboards, a camera for documentation. They arrived at 9. Stephen was already mid-service on a Range Rover that had come in the previous afternoon. He didn't stop working. He answered questions while continuing to work, which was either confidence or efficiency or both. And the officials, who had clearly been behind something I was discovering with the findings and nothings was also a possible outcome of an inspection. Moved through the garage with the careful thoroughness of people who understood that their job was to document, not to decide. The parts inventory was examined. Every old stock component had a corresponding supplier invoice, most of them from a distributor Stephen had worked with since 2011, a family-run operation in Pennsylvania that specialized in legacy European parts. The invoices were handwritten in many cases, the kind of supplier relationship that predated the internet and had survived it. Legal, documented, traceable. The tool certification records were clean. The business license was current. The insurance documents were filed correctly and updated within the past months. The official systems were there 2 hours and 20 minutes. They are left with photographs and notes and no citations. What they left behind was something they hadn't brought. The story of the inspection itself. Because by Thursday afternoon, 2 automotive forum moderators had posted about it. By Friday morning, the trade publication had a follow-up item noting that a regulatory inspection had occurred, which was accurate, but placed up the fact of the inspection in context that implied ongoing concern rather than resolution. The inspection had found nothing. The story of the inspection found an audience anyway. Kathleen was watching all of this from the slight remove of her office and the slight remove of a professional calculation she kept running, arriving at the same answer too, which was that she didn't like the answer. She was making a list of reasons to stay quiet. The list was real, and she believed every item on it, and it was the wrong list. She drove to Dre Auto on a Thursday afternoon, unannounced. No particular agenda except that she'd been telling herself she was going to go back for a quick and had been not going. She was done not going. Lennon was there. This was not surprising.
He'd spent some results since some point in the previous 4 days.
Celso felt more often than not.
Drinking coffee and reading technical documentation and having occasional conversations with Cora that Kathleen gathered were becoming a regular feature of the garage's daily life.
Cora was at the workbench updating the log. 31 entries now. She'd started a second column tracking where each customer had come from. Which forum, which article, which referral. Because she decided that understanding the source of the business was as important as tracking the business itself. Stephen was on the underside of the Aston Martin, which was proving more involved than expected, because the grounding fault had a secondary fault that had been masked by it. He heard Kathleen come in and came out from under the car without apparent hurry. They looked at each other for a moment.
Trade piece.
He waited. I know where it came from. I know too. He said it without drama. Doesn't change the word.
The thing about that sentence was the thing about all his sentences, which was then contains actors out the to know more. Yeah, and some of it consistently landed as though they had been said by sentences who had considered every alternative and discarded them not out of laziness, but out of precision.
Kathleen felt the thing she'd been feeling in her chest for the past 10 days clarify to something similar,
which was that she was done waiting to decide what kind of person she was going to be about this.
I've been invited to speak at the Tri-State Automotive Showcase next week. Industry event, manufacturer, dealers, press. I was going as myself, my company, standard speaking slot. Stephen said nothing. I want to add you to the program. Not me. Not what I've taught.
The question motivation, what question of
logistics. Because what you do deserves to be seen by people who make decisions about what the industry looks like. She paused. And because someone is trying to make you invisible again, and I'm not willing to let that happen without saying something about it. Lennon looked up from his documentation. Cora had stopped writing.
Stephen looked at Bosch. One could stop now and the spot it had occupied since the night had arrived and hadn't fully left. Then he looked at Kathleen with the steady grey eyes of someone who was genuinely thinking, not performing the act of thinking.
I'll come, he said. I'm not going to prepare remarks. You won't need to. Cora from the workbench without looking up from the notebook. Showcase was 10 days out. In the intervening period, the green notebook acquired 14 more entries. A McLaren 570S whose owner had been quoted $11,000 for a clutch actuator replacement. Friction disc wear $680. A Ferrari whose service center had declared a drivetrain component irreparable without a full rebuild at $31,000. Debris from differential actuator housing, $200 in an afternoon. A collection of small switchkills whose owners had come not because of drama,
but because of the word had reached the wrong
people, which is the way of cravels when the thing being constrained is useful rather than merely interesting. Lennon started making calls of his own. He did this quietly from the aluminum chair, mostly in the afternoons. He had contacts in the motorsport community.
Engineers, team principals, a few journalists who covered the technical side rather than the glamour side.
And he was telling them a version of what he'd told Stephen, that there was something worth seeing here, in a garage on County Road 9, and that if they had the chance to be at the showcase, they might want to take it. Ronald Voss had accepted his own invitation to the showcase months earlier, which Kathleen knew because the showcase organizers had mentioned it when she'd called to add Stephen's name. She'd said nothing about it. She'd just noted it, filed it, and moved on to the next thing she had to do. Because some problems resolve themselves if you wait, and some problems you have to walk into deliberately, in a room full of people who need to see something, and let the work speak at the volume it deserves. The night before the showcase, Kathleen sat in her apartment with city lights through the window and the Porsche lawn their 7 floors below and made no lists, developed no talking points, practiced. She thought about her father, about Tuesdays, about the particular sound of a car engine that is working the way it was designed to work, which is different from the sound of an engine that has been fixed. It is simply the sound of something that was never actually broken. She thought about what it costs to listen. What it costs to stop listening. What gets in the space between the pretend and the reality. She turned the light off at 11. And across the city, in a garage that had been operating since 1968 through stubbornness and in 3 generations and the free fossility for substitute a printout of the actual thing, Stephen Dre finished the last car of the day, put every tool back in its place, and sat for a moment in the quiet. The radio had stopped at some point. The lot outside was empty. Cora was asleep. He looked at the folding chair's his cabinet, at the green notebook on the workbench, at the list of vehicles waiting for next week, which had grown long enough that he'd started a second page. And he thought, as he sometimes did in the stillness of late evening, in a place built by the people who had come before him, about a gap that mix between what systems can measure and what they routinely miss, about all the cars sitting in dealership lots being told the wrong thing by the right equipment. But the self-confidence that has forgot to remain curious. He turned the shop light off, walked to the door, looked back once at the garage, the tools, the drawers, the lifetime of organized attention that had accumulated in space, and then went to check on his daughter, which was the thing he'd been doing every night for 3 years, and for as long as she would allow it, which he suspected, knowing Cora, would be longer than she would ever admit. The convention center had the particular energy of a room where everyone knew we were being watched, including the people doing the watching. Floor-to-ceiling glass on the south wall, 2 rows of elevated display platforms running the length of the hall, each vehicle lit from above with the precise calculation of two people who understood that light was a form of argument. Banner installations for the manufacturer groups curved overhead in a sequence that implied cooperation while maintaining hierarchy. 300 people. Maybe 350. Kind of room where every conversation was also a transaction of some kind. Where the genuinely passionate and the professionally interested optimist at the same space was with the same surface expression, which made it difficult to tell them apart unless you watched what they looked at when they thought no one was watching them. Ronald Voss had taken a seat in the second row, left center. Not the front was too obvious, too eager. Second row, left center was as the calculated position of a man who wanted to be seen without appearing to want it. He'd brought 2 of his service managers, both of whom sat behind him with the attentive positioning of people whose job was to be present and legible. Voss himself wore charcoal, no tie, the collar of a white shirt open one button, the specific aesthetic of someone who had researched the dress code of authority. Steve Hawkins fought the truck at the far end of the lot, which held a certain IRA given the vehicles surrounding it, and walked into the convention center alone. He had not changed his work shirt. He had put on a clean one, dark blue instead of the usual, name still on the chest, but it was unmistakably what it was. A work shirt at a formal industry event, worn by someone who had simply not considered this to be relevant information. He stood near the back wall and looked at the cars on the display platforms with the focused interest of a person who found vehicles genuinely interesting, which distinguished him from roughly a third of the room. Kathleen found him there when she arrived. She'd worn the navy blazer, the one she wore to the things that mattered. Her hair down, which was the version of herself she reserved for rooms where she intended to be heard. She said nothing to him about the program, the schedule, the strategy. Just, you came. And Stephen, looking at the display nearest him, you said to, which was, in its way, a complete answer. The first session covered EV charging infrastructure, polite attention, reasonable questions from the audience. Nothing that would unseat anyone's assumptions. The second session featured a manufacturer representative presenting predictive diagnostic AI. The idea that machine learning applied to fleet telemetries could identify failure patterns before they produced systems. It was a good presentation, genuinely impressive data, the kind of thing that made the future feel organized and reassuring. Stephen raised his hand from the back. The question he asked was specific and technical in a way that required the presenter to stop and actually think before responding. It was about the capacity of current sensor architectures to distinguish between a primary fault and a secondary fault cascade when both were producing overlapping code signatures on the same CAN bus network. The presenter paused, recalibrated, answered more carefully than he'd planned to. 3 engineers in the audience, one of whom was a former colleague and had called the previous week, exchanged a look. Voss watched this exchange without reacting. 40 minutes into the third session, the car failed. Not with drama, not with noise or smoke or any of the signals that announce themselves. The Corvette Z06 Limited Edition for a display platform, a vehicle that had arrived that morning, that had not yet been publicly announced, that was technically the centerpiece of the event's third quarter reveal, was started for a demo sequence and simply refused to leave park. Every system indicator was clean. Every light on the dashboard said the car was operational. The car was completely and inexplicably unable to move. This was the moment the room changed. The manufacturer's certified technician, the man who had traveled with the car specifically to handle any contingency, ran a full diagnostic scan. 16 minutes. The results were inconclusive in the particular way that there's what was a fault somewhere the scan hadn't been designed to find. 3 additional technicians from dealerships in attendance were invited to assess. 2 of them were Vazas people. All 4 systems, 4 different software platforms, 5 minutes collective attention. Consensus, a software cascade in the body control module. The car needed to be transported to a certified facility, 2 to 3 days minimum. Voss had already moved toward the front of the room. He had the expression of a man who had identified a moment and was preparing to occupy it. He began a sentence about the inherent limitations of mechanical incision in an era defined by software complexity. Kathleen moved first. She went directly to the back wall. She found Stephen. He had put his coffee down before the reached him, which meant he had already read her expression from 30 feet. "I need you to look at something." He said nothing, followed her. The room goes silent exactly. It went quieter. Rooms do when you sort of ramble simultaneously decide that what is about to happen is more interesting than what they had been doing. Stephen stood in front of the Corvette. He looked at it. Not performing, not warming up. Just looking, the way someone looks at a problem they haven't fully introduced themselves to yet. He sat down, looked through the driver's window at the dashboard display, stood, walked to the rear quarter panel, and crouched near the lower edge of the body, staying there long enough that several people in the immediate vicinity exchanged glances. Then he asked the owner to open the hood. Someone offered him a diagnostic tablet. He waved it off, not rudely, the way you wave off something when your hands are already doing what they needed to do. He stood above the engine, both hands on the frame edge, still, 22 seconds, which is long enough to be noticeable, and long enough to make a room of people wonder what kind of information a person could possibly be receiving that required that level of stillness. Then he placed one hand on the transmission control module housing and held it there. 15 seconds, maybe 20. And then, inspection mirror, 22-gauge test lead. Someone in the front section of the audience. Not a technician, a collector who happened to carry a kit because that was the kind of person he was. Stood up and walked to his display table and came back with both. No one asked him to. No one needed to. 2 minutes passed. Stephen working in the engine bay with the mirror and the lead, following a trace that was invisible to everyone watching, which was part of the thing, that there was nothing dramatic to observe, just a man and an engine and the particular attention that does distribute itself across an audience. He held up a crimp connector the size of a thumbnail. Ground wire in the TCM harness. His voice even. The Latin harness is simply the right volume to the space. Micro fracture at the crimp point failure on not even 1% integrity. Enough for every electronic system to function normally. Not enough for the shift engaged and complete. The room held its breath. Crimping tool. The same collector who at this point had fitted to the bit produced while from the kit. Stephen repaired the connection. He did not rush. He also did not slow down to perform the act of not rushing, which would have been a different thing to He checked the ground continuity, closed the hood, stepped back, nodded to the owner. The owner sat in the car, turned the key, geared into drive. The car moved forward without hesitation, smooth, immediate, as though nothing had ever been wrong. Because as Stephen would say afterward, and as Kathleen had heard before in a different context, nothing had been wrong with the parts the system had been pointing at. The whole was completely silent. Then the technician who had spent 35 minutes with 4 diagnostic systems asked the question, and his voice had in it something that wasn't quite embarrassing and wasn't quite all, but lived in the district between them. "How did you know where to look?" Stephen straightened up. He looked across the hood. He looked at the room, not performing the looking, not playing to the gallery. just actually looking at the people who had spent past hour applying every instrument available and arriving at the wrong conclusion. You were listening to computers, he said. I was listening to the car. Nothing, then everything. One person started, then in the room followed. Voss was already moving by the time the applause started. Not running, not obviously fleeing, just moving toward the side exit with the efficiency of a man who has decided that the ratio of staying to going has just permanently shifted against staying. His service managers looked at each other, looked at his retreating back, looked at the room, stayed. The compliance review that Voss had initiated, the ones designed to scrutiny toward Dre Auto, expanded in the weeks that followed in a particular way. There's people who started them, but have reasons to hope they won't. The licensing office, having opened a broader look at part sourcing practices in the region's service industry, reviewed documentation across multiple facilities. Dre Auto's records remain exactly where they had been. Clean, handwritten, meticulous, traceable. Voss Automotive's records told a different story. Not a dramatic one. Not fraud, not theft. Just a long, low-grade accumulation of labor charges that didn't align with logged hours. Diagnostic fees applied to procedures completed in a fraction of the documented time. The kinds of discrepancies that exist in every industry where the incentive is to bill at the rate of what should have been done rather than what was done. And that usually stay invisible until something draws attention and the wrong result at the wrong moment. The investigation was quiet. The conclusion was quiet. The announcement in November used the phrase mutual agreement to part ways, which is just the corporate language for something that both parties understand and neither one wants to describe accurately in public. Voss left. The dealership hired someone else. The showroom kept the track, lighting, and the leather lounges and the espresso machines, and began the slow business of building around a service department that had lost the thing it had traded on. Sharon wrote a single paragraph about it, buried in a year-end industry roundup. She called Kathleen before it ran, not to ask permission, just to say it was coming, says. Kathleen said, write it accurately. That's all I ask. Sharon, who always wrote it accurately, when have I not? Gary Lennon came back twice after the showcase. First with a car, a different one. A Boxster with a coolant leak that had been misdiagnosed as a cracked head gasket. Stephen found a deteriorated coolant pipe junction. The kind of deterioration that produced symptoms indistinguishable from gasket failure, unless you trace the leak to its source rather than its consequence. $110. The difference between that and the head gasket repair had been $11,000. The second time, Lennon came with no car, just himself and an envelope, which he set on the parts cabinet, and I did not ask explanation until Stephen had finished what he was doing and came to look at it. Inside was a letter. The Kellner Racing Collective, a newly formed endurance team privately funded out of Charlotte, looking for a technical lead with transmission system expertise. The letter was precise about what the role was and what it wasn't. Not a full-time position, a consulting engagement with flexibility around existing commitments. The compensation number was not small. Stephen read the letter, folded it, set it on the cabinet. Lennon Sopho said. Steve saw Sopho.
You could first two semesters.
Cora's been flexible. She has a lab partner she's been working with since September, Stephen said, and a history project due in January, and she runs cross-country on Tuesdays and Thursdays. A pause. None of that is in Charlotte. Lennon looked at him for a long moment. This is a significant offer. You know what you're declining. Stephen said, which was the correction that met myself, and both of them understood it. Lennon picked up his coffee. I'll keep the offer open. 6 months. That's up to you, I know it is. Lennon looked around the garage, the tools, the drawers, the decades of accumulated method. Keep sending cars, those I'll take. Cora heard none of this directly, but she heard enough. The way she always heard enough. And then each Stephen came into the kitchen to where she was reading homework. She did that bar, she continued her expression that in this semester says something, and had decided what she thought about it. She said, you didn't know. She looked at him for a moment with her mother's eyes, the blue ones, the ones that saw things clearly and said so without requiring you to respond. Then she went back to her homework. Good, she said, and didn't look up again, which was for Cora a complete sentence. The sign went up on a Saturday in late November. She had been thinking about the wording for several days.
Not the name. Dre Auto Repair since 1968, unchanged, but the line beneath, the one her grandfather had put there decades ago, and at that time and weather had eventually reduced to illegibility.
She made a new one on the kitchen table, with cardboard and a black marker and a ruler. And she mounted it herself above the door, standing on the lower rung of the torchlight at the shop, because she was still an inch short of reaching without it. Dre Auto Repair. We listened first. She called Stephen out from the bay. He came with his hands in his pockets, which was what he did, wasn't sure what he was able to be shown. He stood in the cracked parking lot in the November air and looked at it. Thorfra stood between him, arms crossed, not watching the sign, watching him. Well, she said. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that isn't the absence of thought, but the presence of something that takes time to name. She nodded, and she'd known it before she made it, which was usually how she operated. Kathleen arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in early December. No call ahead. No particular reason given, because no particular reason was needed anymore. She'd been bumped by with them some regularity in the weeks since the showcase, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes longer, always with the Porsche, always parking in the same spot nearest the door that the car had claimed as its own on the night it arrived. The lot held 7 cars. A Porsche, 2 BMWs, Range Rover, a Ferrari that had come all the way from Philadelphia because Jeffrey Crane Foffisum told the owner personally, a Bentley with an electrical fault its manufacturer's facility had declared would require a complete wiring harness rebuild, and a Subaru belonging to a woman from the county who had found Dre Auto the original way, because her car had broken down nearby and there'd been a light on. Stephen was closing the hood of the Bentley when Kathleen came through the door. The sound of it, solid, final, the sound of something correctly completed, carried through the open bay. She stood in the doorway and looked at the lot, at the sign above the door, at the afternoon light going amber across the cracked asphalt. "You're still here," she said. He turned, looked at her. "You say that like you expected otherwise." Against the doorframe, the posh of man who'd been in a place enough times to just stop being a visitor. I just like saying it. He picked up the shop cloth, looked at the Porsche in its spot. "You still think you should have bought a new car?" he asked. She looked at the Porsche, at the sign, at the lot full of vehicles that had come from everywhere, and by people who had learned the distance to credential and actual knowledge it was supposed to represent. If I stop listening," she said, which was his line, returned to him. He recognized it, and something in his expression, not a smile exactly, more the expression beneath a smile, the one that arrives before the face decides what to do with it, shifted. Cora appeared in the office doorway, looked at both of them, looked at the lot, looked at the sign. "There are 2 more cars coming at 4, she said. Then, to no one in particular, I updated the log, green notebook, 58 entries now, a second column tracking referral sources, a third column she'd added last week recording the time between symptom onset and correct diagnosis. At dealerships, averaged 14 days. At Dre Auto, it averaged 1 afternoon. She was going to need a third notebook as soon. Already bought it. The afternoon held in that particular December amber that makes everything look slightly more permanent than it is. The radio inside played something old and unhurried. The street was quiet, and in a garage that had been standing since 1968. Built by a man who had believed that it was important to consumer was not believe it was his part, but listened past. The work continued, not because anyone had made a decision about the future, not because anything had been resolved clear than life usually allows, but because the next car was coming at 4, and it needed someone to open the hood and be still for a moment, and actually hear what it was saying, which, it turned out, was the only credential that had ever mattered.